present some of our findings from semantics perspective on Wannacry and our investigation. This is actually my first time at BotConf and first time speaking, so be kind. If I sound a bit weird, I'm also suffering from a cold, so don't worry about that if I sound a bit odd. So the Wannacry investigation was something that was kind of a big thing for us in terms of we start seeing some massive increases in kind of exploitation attempts for Eternal Blue. And it was one of those things that was happening on a Friday. It was coming into the afternoon. When we start seeing these red flags with these amount of detection attempts, we knew that it was going to be something that was massive, and it was our team that were called in. So a bit of background for myself as well. I've been working with Semantic for the last 8 years or so. Initially, I came in as a reverse engineer. We kind of pull apart malware, kind of figure out what it does, and then we'd write detection signatures for our different protection technologies. Later, I joined a team called the Attack Investigations Team. So kind of our role is looking at high-profile attacks. We do a lot of tracking of APT groups as well, and we kind of feed all that information that we kind of get into other teams within Semantic to help protect our customers a little bit further. So overview of the talk, just to kind of give you a sense of where you stand in it. It's short enough. I'll try to keep it within the 30 minutes, so there's some time for questions as well. So we have a bit of background about Wannacry, which most of you will be all familiar with. So kind of a roundup of what we were able to find out based on what was publicized. We'll talk about our investigation. So in a lot of cases, people were interested in trying to identify where the attack was coming from. For us, we were able to identify an earlier variant that was used that predated the May attacks, and that kind of gave us the most amount of insights into the attackers and links to other groups and other activities, which I'll discuss in that section. I'll also talk about those links and what we found, some shared code, and kind of any of the other related activity that we found as part of that as well. And then we'll just kind of wrap it up with some lessons learned and some takeaways. So the background itself. So before I kind of talk about Wannacry, I kind of want to put things into, or talk about kind of context to put things into perspective. So when people talk about massive attacks that were super impactful, some of the names that kind of float to the top are usually Blaster, and this is kind of a super old one back from 2003. And this is where we've seen like 16 million machines that were infected in a single day, which is a massive number. A similar one that kind of floats to the top is Configure. So Configure had up to 15 million machines that had been infected within a 24-hour period. And this was kind of later on in November 2008. But then we had Wannacry in May. And the numbers for Wannacry were relatively small in comparison to some of the other big attacks. We only seen around like 300,000 or maybe a little bit more machines that had been infected by Wannacry. And this is kind of a bit odd. And the reason why this is because of the impact that it had. So what happened was when people came into work, they were turning on machines, they started receiving or seeing this onto the machine on basically requesting payment of bitcoins up to about $300, informing them that their machine had been held to ransom and that their files had been encrypted. And this is obviously more impactful than what you see with some of the other kind of big threats where we had millions of machines infected, where those threats would run in the background, but this was more impactful in that it was being disruptive. It was stopping productivity. And when I say impacts, what I mean is when we start seeing some of the reports kind of floating around some social media platforms, people posting pictures, and some media outlets reporting on some of the disruptions that were actually incurred by this. And we start seeing attacks that were on billboards, where they were becoming locked. We've seen kiosks, emergency departments. We've seen train stations in Germany, ATMs, home TVs, even the NHS in the UK, and even FedEx as well. So this was apparent that it was a massive issue. And this was why our team was called in on this, to be able to kind of help other teams in Semantic kind of figure out what was going on, how they were doing their spreading, if there was any links to other groups, any known attacks, and what we could do to kind of help our customers kind of protect themselves from that. In terms of distribution, when we start looking at some of the exploitation attempts from Eternal Blue, we've seen a massive surge which occurred on May 12th. And this is what kind of set off red flags for us, and we knew it was going to be a long weekend at this stage. And this is kind of why it kind of led into the makes me wanna cry, because we knew it was going to be a painful investigation from our side, particularly the fact that we were going to have to pull in resources over the weekend. What we seen was an initial surge up to around just over 80,000 machines that had been attempting to spread Wannacry. But then we've seen some initial drop-off as we entered the weekend, and followed by a resurgence later on. And it was likely that this resurgence was caused by people coming back in over the weekend on Monday, and then turning on their machines and then finding that it was infected. We also took all the data we were able to collect from our telemetry and just kind of mapped it out over time across a heat map. And we found that some of the countries that were impacted kind of early on and kind of had massive numbers in terms of infections was the likes of like Russia, China, Brazil. And these are kind of countries that have really good internet access, but they, for whatever reason, have a lot of unpatched systems. And these were the countries that we started seeing reports come from in the early days when Wannacry started spreading. In terms of spreading itself, there's a couple of methods that it uses. So the first is where it enumerates all the network adapters to collect IP information about the system it had infected. It'll generate a list of IP addresses within those subnets, and then essentially try to connect to all those machines and connect over port 445, attempt to make a successful connection. If a successful connection is actually made, it'll then prepare the Eternal Blue exploit to be able to deploy Wannacry onto those remote machines. It'll also generate a random IP address. So it'll generate up to about 128 random IP addresses. It'll attempt a connection with them. If a connection is successful, again, it'll prepare the Eternal Blue exploit, and then it will try to deploy Wannacry onto those machines. For any time it had a successful connection, it would then scan all the IPs from 1 to 225 within that same subnet to be able to see could it connect to any of those ones. So the kill switch itself, so in the code, there was basically a hard-coded domain, which was an unregistered domain. And this domain basically worked as a type of kill switch. So if a connection could be made to this domain and a successful response was given back, it would then essentially terminate itself, so it wouldn't continue spreading. Malware Tech, or Marcus, had identified this, and he registered the domain as part of his botnet tracking. So I think at the time, he even admitted that he wasn't aware that it was actually a kill switch. He just seen an unregistered domain as part of his analysis and then registered that domain. I think he had a story up on his blog kind of detailing kind of the circumstances and the events that kind of led to understanding why it actually became a kill switch at a later stage. So it was theorized that this was likely used to evade sandboxing. So in most sandbox environments, you'll generally see people submit samples, and they'll want to be able to capture or fake any C2 or command and control infrastructure responses, basically to extract C2s quickly and usually to kind of cluster malware at later stages. We started to sinkhole the domain, which stopped the spreading of Wannacry, which was a really good thing. But what we kind of gave as tips to some of our customers was, instead of relying on an external domain, ensure that you create DNS entries for any of your local machines, so it resolves to a machine that's within your own network that you control, so your own private sinkhole as such. And the reason why we were doing this was, while people were relying on this external domain, they were adding the unregistered domain to their whitelists, which kind of presented a couple of issues. One, there was reports of attacks being performed, so DDoS attacks on from the Mirai botnet against the domain that, or the sinkhole that Malware Tech was running. And if that had succeeded, then it would have allowed Wannacry to spread even further. There was also kind of the ability whereby, if at later stages people had forgotten that they had added this domain into their whitelists, and that domain became unregistered and then start being used for malicious purposes at a later stage, they've effectively given a free pass. So this was just something that we were kind of suggesting as best practice to them. In terms of payment, it seemed like the guys who created Wannacry kind of made a few mistakes or kind of hurried the development of the tool itself. So it looked like there was a point where a Bitcoin generator, so a Bitcoin address generator was supposed to be dropped to disk. And when you were looking at the code itself, it looked like it was calling the Bitcoin address generator before it was even written to disk. So this was kind of a big thing whereby it wasn't able to generate a unique address for each infection, which meant that it actually had to fall back to some default values that had been hard-coded in to the samples themselves. About 13 hours later, they also tried to release a fix for this, but at this point, the damage had been done. Mitigation had been kind of rolled out across different organizations. The kill switch had been put in place. So it kind of didn't have much effect, really. So without the unique Bitcoin address generator, it defaulted to the three kind of default addresses that were embedded within the sample itself. And the attackers were demanding around $300 in Bitcoins and then saying that it might double in price after 3 days if there was no payment received. After 7 days, the attackers also claimed that files would be lost or modified, but there was actually no evidence of this. So even when we looked at the code itself, we couldn't see anything in there that would actually try to delete the files or even modify them after this time period. Last time I checked, there was around $90,000 in the Bitcoin addresses that had been paid. It may have changed since, but unlikely. And even when it kind of came to the deadline in terms of the amount of time that the attackers had given people to kind of pay up the ransom, we've seen that they kind of made a last plea. So they were sending out messages, which was kind of funny because they start referring to their victims as customers in this case. So for our investigation, identifying the vector of the attack was kind of super difficult, and this was mainly down to a couple of reasons. So the first one was kind of larger number of organizations were impacted, so the amount of organizations that were impacted by the threat, and also a large amount of traffic that had been generated by the spreading of Wannacry. And this made it difficult to then dig through like your telemetry and dig through logs to kind of identify that first machine that had been infected, particularly when it was likely going to be outside your own customer base. And it was a big thing for a lot of groups that we were in talking about this threat at the time. They wanted to find patient zero, and they thought that this would be kind of the way to be able to identify how it initially got on. Like, for example, was it received by an email that then starts spreading? But this was kind of some of the questions that the groups wanted to answer. And for us, what we actually did was had a look at the samples that we had collected ourselves. We kind of tore it apart a bit and then looked for kind of some unique markers, and we created a somewhat loose signature that we could then use to kind of query or search across our big file repository. And we actually got a couple of hits, which is a bit odd, because the hits that we got were additional samples that looked like Wannacry, but they weren't anything that had been reported as part of the May attacks. And what we did was we took those samples and then we ran them against our telemetry to see was there any customers that had been impacted by these samples. And we actually found there was about 6 organizations. And this predated the attacks that we had in May all the way back to February. So this obviously was a big thing for us. So we wanted to kind of jump in on this and kind of figure out what was going on and was there any activities around it. And was this our essentially patient zero? And this is what gave us the most insights to these attacks and allowed us to kind of create links to other groups and other activity that I'll later talk about. So when we first found these new samples, we kind of had a quick look to see what similarities there were or what differences there was. And the first main difference was it didn't contain the Eternal Blue exploit code at all. And this was something that was like, oh, right, this is a big thing. This is something that might predate when Eternal Blue was actually added to Wannacry. So we dubbed this version 1. Some of the similarities, these are some of the similar or kind of simplistic ones. So like the decrypting file name, for example, wannadecryptor.exe used exclamations instead of @ symbols. The component files in the archives that was embedded within the resources followed similar naming conventions. The configuration format was identical across the two samples, and the passwords used to encrypt the archive that was embedded within it were somewhat similar as well. So they kind of reference Wannacry. For the first victim that we actually found, this was our February victim. We weren't able to retrieve a full timeline of the events that happened on the machine, but we started looking at any of the events around the time we've seen Wannacry version 1 on this, within this organization. And we found some additional tools and some activity there. The first one was we've seen Minicats had been deployed, and it had been used to dump credentials from the machine that had been infected. Those credentials were then later stored into a file called cg.wry. And then another tool which kind of looked like a network scanner called HP Tasks was also deployed onto that machine. It looks like the attackers could provide a command line argument which would allow it to assert or search through an IP range and basically attempt to mount remote shares using the credentials from that cg.wry file. If it was able to create a successful connection, it would then essentially add this to a log file, and then it would copy some Wannacry components from version 1 across onto these machines. And the table that I've listed here kind of gives you some details of some of those components that were copied across. So we've seen like the application for displaying the messages which were stored in some additional files. We also had the Wannacry encryption component itself, the configuration details, and then the message files. So most of your files are encrypted, or the instructions of how to be able to pay your Bitcoin ransom. And the February victim as well. We also seen that this HP task tool was also the tool that was used to execute the newly copied Wannacry samples on these remote machines. And we also had identified some additional tools and backdoors that were on the infected machines as well. We weren't able at the time to kind of make any additional links, but when we started looking at some of the victims from March and April, that kind of cleared up the picture for us. So some of the tools that we did find in this organization was a hack tool, we had Destover and Volgamer, a downloader, and we had some proxy tools as well. So the March and April victims. So we had signs of additional victims. We had at least 5 organizations that we had identified that had been impacted throughout this period. New samples of Wannacry, or modified versions of Wannacry version 1, had been prepared for each of these victims, and they had been delivered. When we looked at the victimology itself, it kind of seemed a bit odd. Majority of all these victims were actually located within Asia, but there was no real pattern to the type of industries that were being impacted. So we had organizations from government, hospitality, chemical industries, but the only kind of pattern that kind of emerged from that was they were all organizations. None of them were individuals or consumers. And we also found some additional backdoors, and this is what kind of gave us the most amount of information linking it back to previous attacks. Within these organizations, we had seen in some cases a new backdoor that hadn't been identified before, called Trojan Alphanac, had been identified, and we had evidence of this tool being used to deploy Wannacry. We also had another backdoor called Trojan Bravanac, and we also were able to find evidence of this being used to deploy Wannacry in some of these victims. So Alphanac itself had been used to drop Wannacry in 3 victims. It's a slightly modified version that was deployed to each of these, or within each of these environments. The backdoor itself had been copied onto the machines, and then we've seen 2 minutes later Minicats being deployed through that tool. Minicats was then executed to essentially dump the credentials, and then it would install WinRAR to be able to collect those credentials and move it off to some attacker control infrastructure. Later, we've seen another tool called G.exe being deployed, and this performed DNS lookups. And this was used basically to identify some machines that were of value to the attackers. So they used that to profile the network as such, and they returned and even collected some additional information at later stages. We also found some additional tools that were also seen in the February victim as well. So again, that kind of network scanning tool that we identified. And that was used to deploy Wannacry, and also being used to execute the samples on those remote machines. Wannacry itself was somewhat different in that it actually used a set of common passwords to be able to connect to SMB shares in order to copy across Wannacry. And we also found other variants of Wannacry which actually contain Wannacry embedded within itself. So the links and related activity. So I'll try to get through this quickly. Only probably take a couple of minutes because I want to open it up for questions as well. We found some network or shared network code between Doozer and Alphanac. And Doozer is a tool that was used by the group Lazarus in previous attacks. It had similar code for generating the buffer that was used for command and control communications, somewhat of a fake SSL handshake. It generated a random number, which was then used to look up a table to send some data to the C2s. This table was identical across these two samples, which was a kind of strong indication that this was shared code between these two. They also appended the same kind of marker or signature to the start of any C2 communications as well. When we decrypted some of the strings within the two samples, so Alphanac and Doozer, we found that the decrypted strings were pretty much identical for the most part. And this again was a strong indicator that there was overlap. And we also found overlap with Wannacry and Doozer again, in that they kind of shared cryptographic number related routines. There was also some additional shared code that was called out by Google. So Neil had actually posted 2 hashes and some address locations. The first hash was Wannacry, the second was a variant of Contp. Again, Contp is being used by Lazarus, this group which had been used against several banks in the past. We also had shared code, which was part of like a custom SSL implementation. So generally in OpenSSL, you have around 300 plus ciphers that you can choose from. In this implementation, it was limited to about 75. And we'd only seen that across these 2 samples. And there was also other chip-ins from other people kind of identifying that this was part of Lazarus, as you can see there from Cossen's Yarrow rule. There was also some temporal attribution as well. So in some of the victims, we also found some additional Lazarus tools. So we had Destover and Volgamer, and there's been many links kind of already documented between those two. And we also seen Alphanac being used in another sample, which was job inquiry resume, which kind of suggested maybe this initially was impacting these organizations through email. Some of the shared infrastructure as well, we also had shared CNCs. So we had Doozer, which connected to 2 IPs, one of which had been also a CNC for Trojan up Wannacry. And we also had Alphanac, which was also contacting a C2, which was found in the same file. And that in turn also contacted another IP that was shared between backdoor.cluebox, another Lazarus tool. So we are able to assign some confidence values to these kind of links. We had network infrastructure overlap, which we had hard links on, or kind of high confidence. Same with infiltration in terms of the tools that were found. We also had shared code, which kind of ranged between kind of medium to weak, but when you kind of put them all together, it kind of suggested to us that this was a high confidence. And we also had tool co-occurrence, so Lazarus tools on impacted victims that we had Wannacry. And we also kind of had some techniques which we considered weak, so like the use of hard-coded SMB credentials and password lists to be able to spread over SMB, which was also seen in other tools used by Lazarus in the past, such as Jonah. So the lessons learned, we're pretty bad at patching. The patch had been released about a month previous, but yet we still had all these victims that have been impacted by Wannacry, either for reasons like OEM equipment, legal certification reasons, or kind of rogue devices. And we're still bad at performing backups. A lot of people that I was talking to about said, oh, it's cool, I have really good restoration plans in place. But when you ask them what happens when your Active Directory server is knocked offline, or your network is down, how can you restore then? And they were pretty much kind of plain that they were essentially dead in the water at that stage. And there's no such thing as your perimeter. So a lot of other people were saying, oh, I've blocked port 445 on my firewall, I'm good. But that's not really the case. Where you'll see a lot of kind of issues or kind of problems being introduced by, like, let's say, for example, machines coming in and out of your network, links from other vendors to your corporate network, and other things as well, which kind of open your perimeter. So that line between your perimeter and other perimeters kind of become more ambiguous, a bit more blurred as such. And security and policy and procedures and continuity planning does work. For any of the customers that we talked that didn't get impacted by this, they had really good policies in place. They had really good procedures and continuity planning there. And they were able for any ones that were impacted, they were able to quickly restore services and get back to working. So the takeaways, Wannacry is an extremely disruptive attack. And the leak of Eternal Blue was the reason why this turned into a global threat. Expected losses and productivity and efforts to mitigate were significant because of this attack. We found multiple strong links to previous attacks conducted by Lazarus. We had overlaps in some kind of technical aspects like code sharing and C2 communications. We also had previous well-documented links to other attacks, such as the attacks on Sony with Destover and Bangladesh Central Bank with Contapi. We also had, despite the links to Lazarus, it doesn't look like that it was bared kind of hallmarks of a nation state kind of type of campaign for the fact that it looked like that the tool was hurriedly put together. While it might have been conducted by Lazarus, it looks like it was possibly financially motivated initially, but either it got out or something happened where they basically had weaponized it with Eternal Blue and it kind of spread beyond their control. And finally, we're still bad at patching. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for the talk. Sorry we cannot take questions at this time because we are a bit over time, but you can catch probably Alan during the break and ask him questions.
Yeah, feel free to
Thanks.
approach me and ask.